Want to know what Europe does for you? Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on human rights.
70 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these have become a cornerstone of the international system.
But despite global progress, they are coming under increased attack, including in the EU, where growing populist sentiment is leading to the suppression of core human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression. Feel concerned? Stay with us.
As the world prepares to celebrate the 70-year anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first international document to set common standards for all member states, the pivotal role as well as the moral, legal and political significance of human rights internationally have become indisputable.
However, despite progress in many areas on recognition, codification and implementation, human rights today face many challenges and are increasingly rejected on ideological grounds by authoritarian regimes, populist forces and in theatres of war around the world.
According to watchdog organisation Freedom House, political rights and civil liberties around the world deteriorated to the lowest point in more than a decade in 2017, and freedom of the press deteriorated everywhere except in Asia, and the EU itself hasn't been spared by the current backlash.
No, it hasn't. The rise of populist parties in some member states, some of which base their appeal on attacking minorities and curbing women's rights, has placed fundamental rights in the EU at risk. And the recent killings of journalists in the EU is also a worrying trend.
Additionally, new technologies have opened new avenues through which these rights may be threatened, such as online hate speech and the spreading of fake news.
In these troubled times for human rights, opinion polls show that European citizens perceive human rights as one of the most important values for them personally and one of the values that best represent the EU itself. Let's have a look at this.
The EU is founded on respect for human rights as well as respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality and the rule of law, and both its internal and external policies are guided by these principles. According to the Copenhagen criteria, all EU candidate countries must have stable institutions that guarantee respect for human rights and the rule of law if they are to become members of the EU.
The EU has also developed a comprehensive legal framework to protect fundamental rights within the Union and advance them in the wider world. The Charter of Fundamental Rights, adopted in 2000, enshrines the personal, civic, political, economic and social rights to which all EU citizens are entitled, and these must be respected by all EU institutions as well as member states when implementing EU law.
EU institutions can also take action where there is a clear risk of a serious breach of EU values by a member state, as happened recently with Poland, or where there is a serious and persistent breach of these.
The EU also has laws in place prohibiting discrimination across a range of contexts and grounds. The protection is widest in the area of employment, where no one can be discriminated against on the basis of their sex, ethnic and racial origin, religion and belief, disability and sexual orientation, but the same kind of protection could soon apply beyond employment on all these grounds.
And if need be, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg is there to uphold these rights and ensure that European law is interpreted and applied in the same way in every member state.
The EU is also committed to ensure the respect of human rights through its international commitments with organisations such as the UN and the Council of Europe, which have widely recognised charters on human rights.
To promote human rights inside the EU, the Rights, Equality and Citizenship funding programme comes with an envelope of €439 million available until 2020. But other funding lines such as the European Structural and Investment Funds can also be used to this end, and that's not all.
The EU also has programmes in place to ensure the effective application of EU laws in civil and criminal justice, to combat poverty and social exclusion, to promote Europe's values and history, and to help alleviate the repercussions of the migration crisis.
To promote human rights outside the EU, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights supports civil society organisations implementing programmes in favour of human rights and provides emergency assistance to human rights defenders at risk. And this is only one of the programmes available within the EU budget.
Outside this budget, the European Development Fund remains the main programme contributing to human rights support in African, Caribbean and Pacific countries.
Now, what has the EU done to support human rights in the past 5 years? Stay with us.
EU has strengthened its laws to fight human trafficking and adopted new rules to ensure the protection of personal data. It has also taken action to guarantee equality between men and women and non-discrimination, to protect children's rights and help disabled persons to participate fully in society.
In 2017, the European Pillar of Social Rights set a framework for improving working and living conditions in the euro area and in other member states that wish to be part of it. It includes 20 principles and rights, from the right to fair wages to the right to healthcare, from lifelong learning, a better work-life balance, and gender equality to minimum income.
Access to justice, including the right to information and special safeguards for children in criminal proceedings, has also been strengthened. But the EU is also committed to promoting human rights beyond its borders. Now, how does it do that?
First of all, the EU has a wide range of diplomatic tools to defend human rights. It can issue public statements urging respect for human rights, it encourages third countries to ratify international conventions, and it conducts regular dialogues with international organisations and partner countries around the world.
For instance, in the most recent human rights dialogue with China in 2018, the EU addressed the deteriorating civil and political rights situation in the country, the detention and conviction of Chinese human rights defenders, and minority rights.
The EU is also active in promoting human rights at multilateral level, and it continues to use its trade policy leverage as the biggest commercial bloc in the world to encourage third countries to make progress on human and labour rights. So no respect for human rights, no preferential access.
In response to serious human rights violations by government officials or non-state actors, the EU has also not hesitated to impose targeted sanctions, such as asset freezes or travel bans, against those deemed responsible. Recently, it has done so against Myanmar army and police officials involved in atrocities against Rohingyas and against Venezuelan officials suspected of human rights violations.
The European Parliament closely monitors the human rights situation in the world and is very vocal in condemning serious violations of these rights, as has happened recently against the Rohingyas, against women's rights defenders in Saudi Arabia and inside the Gaza Strip.
The Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, awarded every year by the Parliament, is now a widely known instrument to honour those who stand up for human rights around the world. So what more could the EU do in the future? Stay with us.
Well, the EU already has a solid fundamental rights infrastructure in place, but more actions may be needed to address both old and new challenges. The heterogeneity of human rights standards between EU member states, as well as backsliding in recent years, is also a matter of concern.
So further steps could include better implementation of existing laws and further action to complete the legal framework to combat discrimination and strengthen internal mechanisms for upholding the rule of law. There are also discussions on how the European Charter of Human Rights could be used more effectively at EU and national level.
For the European Parliament, consolidating the links between development cooperation and human rights action is also imperative. And another expectation for the EU is to mainstream human rights in all trade and investment agreements it concludes in the future.
Because promoting human rights in the wider world is not only a matter of compliance with fundamental values by the EU. As multilateralism and its underlying values come under threat, the EU is expected to assume its role as a major geopolitical player, inspiring others through its example.
You're listening to European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.